On a chilly autumn night, just outside the peaceful town of Riverside, Officer Robert Chen sat in his patrol car, sipping the last drops of his now cold coffee. The clock on his dashboard read 2:37 a.m., and the quiet streets were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. After 15 years on the force, he thought he'd seen it all: domestic disputes, car chases, even the occasional bank robbery. But tonight would be different. Tonight would change him forever. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 247, we have a report of strange noises coming from 1542 Pine Grove Avenue. Caller is Mrs. Rose, elderly resident next door, reports unusual sounds from the neighbor's basement. She sounds pretty shaken up. Ken straightened in his seat, something about the call tugging at his instincts. Usually, noise complaints went to the younger officers, but something in the dispatcher's voice, a hint of uncertainty, perhaps, made him respond. Copy that, I'll check it out. As he drove through the empty streets, Chen's mind wandered to all the late-night calls he handled over the years. Most turned out to be nothing: cats knocking over trash cans, tree branches scratching against windows, or teenagers playing pranks. But this one felt different. The way the dispatcher described Mrs. Rose's reaction, it wasn't typical. Turning onto Pine Grove Avenue, Chen immediately spotted Mrs. Rose. Despite the late hour and cold weather, the silver-haired woman stood on her front porch in a thick blue robe, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. Her face, lined with worry, lit up with relief when she saw the patrol car. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she called out in a hushed voice as Chen approached. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed to the house next door. "I've lived here for 30 years, and I've never heard anything like this." The Thompsons, they're good people, always quiet, keep to themselves. But these noises, she shuddered. They started about an hour ago. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Chen pulled out his notepad, his pen hovering over the paper. "Can you describe the sounds, Mrs. Rose?" The elderly woman wrung her hands, her voice dropping even lower. "It's like whimpering, but not quite human. And there's scratching, lots of scratching. Sometimes I hear things being moved around." I tried calling their phone, but no one answered. "Their lights are all off except for the basement. Look, you can see a faint light through that window." She pointed to a narrow window at ground level, barely visible from the street. Chen's trained eye swept over the property. The Thompsons' house was a well-maintained two-story colonial with neatly trimmed bushes and a dark blue minivan in the driveway. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but years of experience had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the Thompsons lately? Any strange visitors? Changes in routine?" Chen asked, jotting down notes. Mrs. Rose shook her head. "Mr. Thompson retired last year. He was a veterinarian at the animal hospital downtown. Mrs. Thompson still teaches at the elementary school. They're usually home by 6, and I see them working in their garden on weekends. But lately," she paused, frowning. "Now that you mention it, I've seen Mr. Thompson carrying boxes into the house late at night sometimes. I thought maybe he was taking up a hobby to keep busy in retirement." As if on cue, a sound drifted through the quiet night, a low, keening noise followed by scratching. Chen felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In 15 years of police work, he'd never heard anything quite like it. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his hand instinctively touching his flashlight. "Mrs. Rose, I want you to go inside and lock your doors. If you hear anything concerning, call 911 immediately." The elderly woman nodded, clutching her shawl tighter. "Please be careful, officer. And let me know if everything's okay." The Thompsons, they're good neighbors. I'd hate to think. Ken gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll let you know what I find. Now please, go inside." As Mrs. Rose retreated into her house, Chen stood for a moment, studying the Thompson residence. The strange noises had stopped, but the silence felt heavy, expectant. His instincts were screaming that something wasn't right, but what? The house looked perfectly normal, almost too normal. Taking out his flashlight, Chen began walking toward the Thompsons' front door. Each step felt heavier than the last, his senses heightened, alert for any sound or movement. The faint glow from the basement window caught his attention again, and as he passed by, he could have sworn he heard what sounded like metal scraping against metal. Chen reached for his radio, keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, Unit 247. I'm at 1542 Pine Grove. Something's definitely off here. Going to need backup for a welfare check." The dispatcher's response was immediate. "Copy that, Unit 247. Backup is en route. Maintain position until they arrive." But Chen knew he couldn't wait. Whatever was happening in that basement, his gut told him time might be of the essence. As another whimper echoed through the night, he made his decision. Sometimes being a good cop meant following your instincts, even if it meant bending protocol a little. With his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, Officer Chen approached Thompson's front door. The night had grown eerily quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. His footsteps seemed too loud on the concrete path, each crunch of gravel beneath his boots making him more aware of the silence surrounding him. The porch light was off, but the motion sensor activated as he climbed the 3 wooden steps. The sudden brightness made him blink, revealing a neat welcome mat and 2 empty rocking chairs swaying slightly in the wind. A forgotten coffee mug sat on the small table between them, telling of an ordinary evening suddenly interrupted. Chen pressed the doorbell, its chime echoing through the house. No response. He tried again, then knocked firmly on the door. "Police department. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, is everything all right?" His voice carried clearly, but the house remained silent. The only sign of life was that faint glow from the basement window, now barely visible from his position. Moving away from the front door, Chen walked along the side of the house, his training kicking in as he noted details. The garden Mrs. Rose had mentioned was meticulously maintained, with late-blooming flowers still showing color. A garden hose was neatly coiled, and various tools hung organized on a rack. Everything spoke of careful, methodical owners, which made the current situation even more puzzling. As he approached the basement window, the strange noises started again. This time, he could hear them more clearly, a mixture of whimpering and scratching, but also something that sounded like metal containers being moved. Chen crouched down, using his flashlight to peer through the narrow window. The beam revealed glimpses of what looked like medical equipment, stainless steel tables, cabinets, and what appeared to be monitoring devices. His heart rate quickened. What kind of operation was being run in this basement? The radio on his shoulder crackled softly. "Unit 247, backup is 5 minutes out. What's your status?" Chen kept his voice low as he responded. "I'm at the side of the house. Visible medical equipment in the basement. No response at the front door. Vehicle in driveway matches registration for owners." Just then, a loud clang from inside made him jump. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. This was followed by a muffled voice, the first human sound he'd heard from inside the house. The words weren't clear, but the tone was urgent. Moving quickly but cautiously, Chen made his way to the back of the house. A wooden deck extended from the kitchen door, with steps leading down to a small patio. As he climbed the deck stairs, he noticed something odd. Fresh scuff marks on the wood, as if heavy objects had recently been dragged across it. The back door was unlocked. Chen's hand instinctively moved to his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Something about this situation didn't feel threatening. Unusual, yes, but not dangerous. Still, years of training kept him alert as he slowly opened the door. "Police department. Anyone home?" He called out again, stepping into a spotless kitchen. The room was dark but clean, with dishes drying in a rack and a calendar on the fridge marked with ordinary appointments and reminders. A half-empty glass of water sat on the counter, condensation still beading on its surface. The basement door was directly ahead, slightly ajar. Light spilled out from below, along with those persistent strange sounds. Chen's flashlight revealed steep wooden stairs leading down into whatever mystery awaited him. As he stood at the top of the stairs, Chen thought about waiting for backup. It was procedure after all. But then another whimper echoed up from below, followed by what sounded like a soft sob, definitely human this time. His decision was made. Keeping one hand on the railing, Chen began descending the stairs, each step creaking softly under his weight. The sounds grew louder, more distinct. There was definitely movement below, and now he could smell something too, antiseptic, like in a doctor's office. Halfway down, he called out again, "Mr. Thompson, this is the police. I'm coming down." He wanted to give whoever was down there plenty of warning to avoid any surprises on either side. The movement below stopped. Then a tired voice responded, "Officer? Please, please come down. I can explain everything." Chen continued his descent, his flashlight beam revealing more of the basement with each step. The scene that awaited him at the bottom would change everything he thought he knew about this call. Sometimes, he would later reflect, the most surprising discoveries aren't the ones that shock us with horror, but the ones that touch our hearts in unexpected ways. As he reached the bottom step, Chen took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever he might find. After 15 years on the force, he thought he'd seen everything. But what waited in that basement would prove him wrong, and remind him why he'd become a police officer in the first place. As Officer Chen reached the bottom of the basement stairs, the full scene slowly came into focus under his flashlight beam. The concrete floor had been transformed into something that looked like a makeshift medical facility. Clean white sheets covered several folding tables, and metal cabinets lined the walls. The smell of antiseptic was stronger now, mixing with something else, that distinct scent you only find in veterinary clinics. "Mr. Thompson." Chen called out again, his voice echoing slightly in a large space. A rustling sound came from behind a partial wall, followed by quick footsteps. "I'm here, officer," came the response. Mr. Thompson stepped into view, wearing blue medical scrubs that had seen better days. His gray hair was disheveled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in quite a while. Despite his exhausted appearance, his hands were steady as he held them up to show he wasn't a threat. Before Chen could speak, a whimper caught his attention. It was clearer now, definitely coming from behind that partial wall. Mr. Thompson noticed his reaction and sighed deeply. "Officer, I know how this looks, but please, let me show you something." Chen nodded, keeping a professional distance but sensing no danger from the elderly veterinarian. As they moved around the wall, the true nature of the basement operation became clear. Several large cages lined the back wall, each containing animals in various states of recovery. A golden retriever with a bandaged leg lay quietly in one. In another, a cat with a healing surgical scar watched them cautiously. "That noise your neighbor heard," Mr. Thompson explained, walking over to a larger cage in the corner, "was probably this little guy." He knelt down, speaking softly to something inside. As Chen moved closer, his flashlight revealed a young German shepherd, its leg in a cast, whimpering softly. "Found him 2 nights ago," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Someone had beaten him badly and left him in a ditch off Highway 27. Broken leg, internal injuries, he wouldn't have made it through the night." Chen swept his flashlight around the room again, taking in more details. What he'd initially thought was suspicious medical equipment now made perfect sense. An X-ray machine pushed against one wall, monitoring equipment, surgical tools carefully arranged on clean trays. This wasn't some criminal operation, it was a rescue mission. "After I retired," Mr. Thompson explained, standing up slowly, his knees cracking, "I thought I could just walk away. But then I started getting calls. Former clients, rescue workers, good people who found injured animals but couldn't afford emergency vet care. The regular clinics, well, they have to charge what they charge. But these animals, they don't have anyone else." As if to emphasize his point, a small squeak came from a warming box in the corner. Chen walked over, peering inside to find 3 tiny kittens, barely old enough to open their eyes. "Someone tossed them in a garbage bag behind the supermarket," Mr. Thompson explained. "My wife's been bottle feeding them every 2 hours." The radio on Chen's shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 247, backup is arriving on scene. What's your status?" Chen looked at Mr. Thompson, then at all the animals under his care. He thought about the regulations this setup probably violated, about the zoning laws and permits required for operating a veterinary facility. Then he thought about the alternative, these animals dying alone, suffering without help. "Dispatch, situation is under control," he responded. "Cancel backup. I'll submit a full report." Mr. Thompson's shoulders sagged with relief. "Officer, I know this isn't exactly legal, but I couldn't just." Chen held up his hand, stopping him. "Show me everything," he said, clicking off his flashlight since his eyes had adjusted to the basement's lighting. "I want to understand exactly what you're doing here." For the next 20 minutes, Mr. Thompson gave him a tour of his underground animal hospital. He showed Chen his meticulous medical records, explained his sterilization procedures, and introduced him to each patient. There was the raccoon with the healed broken paw, ready to be released. The elderly poodle whose owner couldn't afford cancer treatments, now recovering from surgery. A box turtle someone had run over, its shell carefully repaired. As they talked, Chen noticed how Mr. Thompson's exhaustion seemed to fade when he spoke about his patients. This wasn't just a hobby or even a calling, it was a mission. Every animal had a story, and every story would have had a tragic ending if not for this basement and this retired vet who couldn't look away from suffering. The whimpering from earlier had stopped. Chen looked over to see the German Shepherd had fallen asleep, probably thanks to pain medication. Its chest rose and fell peacefully, a far cry from the frightened, injured animal it must have been when Mr. Thompson found it. Something about that sleeping dog, safe and cared for despite everything it had been through, made Chen's throat tight. He'd become a cop to help those who couldn't help themselves. Standing in this basement, he realized that's exactly what Mr. Thompson was doing too, just in a different way. Standing in that basement, surrounded by the quiet sounds of healing animals, Officer Chen felt the weight of the decision before him. His police training told him one thing, but his heart was pulling him in a different direction. The soft beeping of monitoring equipment and gentle breathing of sleeping animals filled the silence as he collected his thoughts. "How many?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many animals have you saved down here?" Mr. Thompson walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "I've kept records of everyone," he said, opening it to reveal carefully organized papers. "In the past year, 327. Some were simple fixes, broken bones, infections, things like that. Others," he trailed off, glancing at the German Shepherd. "Others needed more extensive care." Chen picked up one of the papers. It was a detailed medical record for a cat, complete with before and after photos, treatment plans, and follow-up notes. "You document everything." "Have to," Mr. Thompson nodded. "Might be operating out of a basement, but I won't compromise on proper medical care. Each animal gets the same treatment they'd receive at a regular clinic. Sometimes better, because I can spend more time with each one." Just then, they heard footsteps upstairs. Mrs. Thompson's voice called down, "Dear, is everything okay?" I heard voices. "It's all right, honey," Mr. Thompson called back. "We have a visitor. Could you come down? And bring some of that coffee you made earlier." Chen heard more footsteps, and soon Mrs. Thompson appeared on the stairs, carrying a tray with 3 coffee mugs. She was wearing a bathrobe over her pajamas, her silver hair in a neat braid. When she saw Chen's uniform, she froze for a moment, but her husband gave her a reassuring nod. "I was wondering when this day would come," she said softly, setting down the tray on a clean counter. "Officer, I know what we're doing here isn't exactly legal, but if you could see the difference it makes." "Like that one," Mr. Thompson cut in, pointing to a photo on the wall Chen hadn't noticed before. It showed a happy family, 2 young children hugging a healthy-looking Labrador. Their dog got hit by a car. Regular vet wanted $3,000 for surgery. They were going to put him down because they couldn't afford it. Now he's back home, playing with those kids like nothing ever happened. Mrs. Thompson handed Chen a mug of coffee. It was hot and strong, exactly what he needed at this late hour. As he sipped it, she continued her husband's thought. "We don't charge anything. People donate what they can. Some give money, others bring supplies. A few help with the aftercare. It's become a sort of underground community." Chen walked over to the German Shepherd's cage again. The dog had woken up and was watching him with cautious eyes. Slowly, carefully, Chen knelt down and held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, the dog stretched forward and gently licked his fingers. "What's his story?" Chen asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. Mr. Thompson's face darkened. "Dog fighting ring. He wouldn't fight, so he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "A good Samaritan found him and called me. We've been working with the police to track down the people responsible, but you know how these things go. At least we could save him." Chen felt something wet on his cheek and quickly wiped it away. He was thinking about his own dog, Max, who he'd lost 6 months ago to cancer. The treatments had drained his savings, but he'd never regretted a penny of it. Not everyone had that option, though. Mrs. Thompson must have noticed his reaction. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the law and what's right aren't exactly the same thing," she said softly. "We know we're breaking some rules, but we also know we're doing good. These animals deserve a chance." Chen stood up, his decision made. But before he could speak, a quiet meow caught his attention. In a corner cage, a small orange cat was watching him intently. Something about its expression reminded him of Max, the same trusting look, the same gentle spirit. "That one came in yesterday," Mr. Thompson explained. "Found abandoned in a cardboard box. Nothing really wrong with her except malnutrition and a bad case of loneliness. She just needs someone to give her a chance." The cat meowed again, pressing against the cage door. Without thinking, Chen reached over and scratched behind her ears. She immediately started purring, leaning into his touch. Officer Chen sat at the small desk Mr. Thompson had set up in the corner of the basement, flipping through more case files. Each folder told a story of hope, pictures of animals arriving broken and leaving healed, thank you notes from grateful families, even crayon drawings from children whose pets had been saved. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he absorbed the scope of what was happening in this underground sanctuary. "I started small," Mr. Thompson explained, checking on the sleeping German Shepherd. "Just helping neighbors, friends of friends. But word spread. People learn pretty quickly where to go when they're desperate and out of options." He adjusted the dog's blanket with the gentle touch of someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for animals. "Most regular clinics, they have to worry about overhead, insurance, staff salaries. I understand that. But when someone's crying on your doorstep because their kid's best friend needs surgery they can't afford." Mrs. Thompson returned from upstairs with fresh coffee and a plate of cookies. "It was hard at first, keeping it secret," she admitted, setting down the snacks. "But every time we saved an animal that would have been put down, every time we saw a family reunited with their pet, well, it made the risk worth it." The orange cat had been moved to a larger cage and was now contentedly eating from a small bowl. Chen found himself repeatedly glancing at her between reading files. There was something about her spirit, the way she'd already bounced back from her ordeal, that touched him deeply. "Last month," Mr. Thompson continued, pulling out another folder, "a little boy brought in a guinea pig. Walked 2 miles in the rain, holding it in his jacket. The pet store had sold it to him already sick, and his parents couldn't afford treatment. You should have seen his face when we fixed her up. That's why we do this." Chen picked up his radio, which had been silent for the past hour. He knew he had to make a report, had to say something about what he'd found. But as he looked around the basement again, he saw more than just an illegal operation. He saw hope. He saw compassion. He saw everything he'd become a police officer to protect. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "this setup, it's not up to code. You're operating without proper permits, proper zoning." He paused, watching their faces fall. "But I think we can fix that." Mrs. Thompson blinked in surprise. "Fix it?" Chen nodded, warming to his idea. "I know people on the city council. There's a program for licensing home-based veterinary care facilities, especially in underserved areas. It would take some work to get everything up to code, but..." He looked meaningfully around the basement. "You're already doing most things right. The record-keeping, the sterile conditions, the follow-up care. We couldn't afford all the permits," Mr. Thompson said quietly. "And some of these animals, they come from complicated situations, people who can't risk questions being asked." "I understand," Chen replied. "But think about what you could do with proper licensing. You could help even more animals, maybe even train others to do what you do. Create a network of emergency care providers who put saving lives first." The German Shepherd whimpered softly in its sleep, drawing their attention. Mrs. Thompson went over to check on it, her hand gentle on its head. "Sometimes," she said, "angels wear police uniforms instead of wings." Chen felt his eyes getting wet again. He thought about all the times he'd had to enforce the letter of the law when his heart told him the spirit of it meant something different. But tonight, maybe he could do both. The orange cat meowed again, somehow having worked one paw through the cage bars to bat playfully at Chen's sleeve. Mr. Thompson noticed and smiled. "She seems to have chosen you," he said softly. "We usually ask for a small donation for adoptions, but in this case..." Adoption. Chen started to protest, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd been thinking about getting another cat since Max died, but it had never felt right. Until now. Every good deed deserves another, Mrs. Thompson said, already reaching for their adoption paperwork. You're helping us help others. Let us help you too. As Chen watched the orange cat, his orange cat now, playing with a toy through the cage bars, he realized something important. Sometimes the best police work happened not by enforcing laws, but by finding ways to make the law serve justice and compassion equally. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Officer Chen had made good on his promise, working tirelessly to help the Thompsons legitimize their operation. The basement was slowly transforming from a secretive sanctuary into a proper emergency veterinary clinic, though it kept its warm, homey feeling. "Watch your head there," Mr. Thompson called out as Chen ducked under a new overhead light being installed. The basement was bustling with activity. Volunteers from the community had shown up in force once word got out about what the Thompsons had been doing. A local electrician was updating the wiring, while a contractor worked on bringing the ventilation system up to code. The permit office approved the zoning variance, Chen announced, holding up a fresh stack of papers. "They were impressed by your record keeping. All those detailed files really helped." He had to raise his voice slightly to be heard over the sound of power tools and excited chatter. Mrs. Thompson was organizing supplies in the new storage area, tears in her eyes as she watched their dream becoming legitimate. "I still can't believe how much the community has stepped up," she said, gesturing to the pile of donated supplies. Local pet stores had sent food and equipment, and other veterinarians had contributed medical supplies once they heard the story. The German Shepherd, now named Hope by the volunteers, was recovering well. He watched the renovation work from his bed in the corner, his tail wagging whenever someone passed by. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by trust, and a local family had already offered to adopt him once he was fully healed. "Remember that guinea pig case I told you about?" Mr. Thompson asked, showing Chen a new photo on his phone. "The little boy stops by every week now to help clean cages. Says he wants to be a vet when he grows up." The photo showed the young boy carefully feeding a recently rescued rabbit, his face glowing with purpose. Chen smiled, thinking about how one small act of kindness could change so many lives. His own life had certainly changed. The orange cat, whom he named Sunshine, had settled into his home perfectly. She greeted him every evening when he returned from his shift, and somehow always knew when he needed extra comfort after a tough day. "Officer," called a voice from the stairs. It was Mrs. Rose, the neighbor whose late-night call had started everything. She was carrying a large pot of homemade soup for the volunteers. After learning the truth about the strange noises, she'd become one of the Thompsons' biggest supporters, often helping to care for the animals when the couple needed rest. "I never thought my noise complaint would lead to all this," she said, setting down the pot. "Those poor animals. If I'd known sooner, I would have helped years ago." She reached down to pet Hope, who gratefully accepted the attention. Mr. Thompson was showing a group of visiting veterinary students around the facility. They'd heard about the unique emergency clinic and wanted to learn more about providing affordable care to families in need. Sometimes, he explained to them, healing isn't just about medicine. It's about giving hope when people think they've run out of options. Chen watched as Mrs. Thompson demonstrated proper bottle feeding techniques to a new volunteer. The 3 kittens they'd saved had all found homes, but new cases arrived almost daily. Now, though, they didn't have to handle everything alone. "We got another call," Chen said quietly to Mr. Thompson when the students moved on. "A family found an injured owl. Usually, we'd have to wait for wildlife services, but since you're getting your exotic animal certification." Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up. "Bring them in. We'll have everything ready." He turned to prepare a treatment area, moving with the energy of someone half his age. The weight of secrecy had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the joy of being able to help openly. As Chen headed up the stairs to respond to the call, he paused to look back at the scene below. The basement was filled with light now, both from the new fixtures and from the spirit of the people working there. What had started as a suspicious late-night investigation had blossomed into something beautiful, a place where compassion and law worked together instead of against each other. 6 months had passed since that fateful night when Officer Chen first descended those basement stairs. Today, he stood before the city council, preparing to give a presentation about the success of what had become known as Thompson's Hope Center for Animal Care. The basement operation had grown into something far beyond what anyone had imagined. Last year, Chen began, his voice strong with pride. I responded to a noise complaint that changed not just my life, but our entire community. He clicked through slides showing the transformation of the Thompsons' basement. What I found wasn't a crime, it was a miracle happening in secret. And now, thanks to your support, it's a miracle happening in the open. The statistics told an impressive story. In the 6 months since becoming licensed, the center had treated over 500 animals. More importantly, they'd helped countless families keep their beloved pets when they thought they had no options left. The model had been so successful that 3 other cities had reached out to learn how to set up similar programs. After the presentation, Chen drove to the center for their weekly volunteer meeting. The basement had been expanded now, with a proper entrance from the side of the house. A cheerful sign welcomed visitors, and the waiting room was filled with comfortable chairs donated by a local furniture store. Officer Chen called out a young voice. It was the boy with the guinea pig, now a regular volunteer. He was wearing a junior volunteer t-shirt, carefully carrying fresh water to the recovery cages. Wait till you see the new puppy that came in last night. Mr. Thompson emerged from the treatment room, looking tired but happy. He just finished surgery on a cat who'd swallowed a string, a simple procedure that would have cost hundreds at a regular vet, but here the family only had to donate what they could afford. Remember Hope? Mr. Thompson asked, leading Chen to the back area. The German Shepherd who'd once been so badly injured was there, but not as a patient. He'd become the center's therapy dog, helping calm nervous animals and scared children. His new family brought him in 3 times a week to work, and his gentle spirit had helped countless other animals heal. Mrs. Thompson was in her usual spot, training new volunteers. The center now had a partnership with the local veterinary school, providing students with real-world experience in emergency care and teaching them about the importance of accessible veterinary services. "We got another thank you card," she said, holding up a handmade card covered in children's drawings. The Fletcher family's dog, the one who needed the emergency surgery last week. He's home and doing great. Chen felt a familiar warmth in his chest as he looked around the busy center. His own cat, Sunshine, had become something of a mascot, often curling up on his desk in the small office they'd set up for police coordination. They now worked closely with animal control and other law enforcement agencies, helping with rescued animals and providing emergency care in cruelty cases. Mrs. Rose appeared with her usual pot of soup for the volunteers. She'd become the center's unofficial grandmother, keeping everyone well-fed and offering comfort to worried pet owners. "Who would have thought," she said, stirring the soup, "that those strange noises would lead to all this?" Later that evening, as the center quieted down for the night, Chen sat with the Thompsons in their newly renovated break room. On the wall hung photos of their success stories, hundreds of animals who'd been given a second chance. Among them was a special section dedicated to the night everything changed, including a picture of that first visit to the basement. "You know," Mr. Thompson said, looking at the photos, "when you first came down those stairs, I thought it was the end of everything. Turns out it was just the beginning." Mrs. Thompson wiped away a tear. "Now we don't have to turn anyone away. Every animal that comes through that door gets a chance. That's all we ever wanted." Ken thought about how close this place had come to being shut down, how easily things could have gone differently. Sometimes the biggest changes in life came from the smallest choices, a decision to investigate a noise complaint personally, a moment of compassion overriding strict interpretation of rules. As if on cue, the center's phone rang. Another emergency case was coming in. As everyone sprang into action, Chen watched the well-oiled machine that their little community had become. The scared, injured animals that arrived here didn't know about licenses or permits or city regulations. They just knew they'd found a place of healing, a place where people cared. And really, wasn't that what law enforcement was supposed to be about? Not just enforcing rules, but protecting the good in the world, even when it showed up in unexpected places, like strange noises coming from a basement in the middle of the night.